Good morning, High Rock, and welcome to our daily devotion. Michael, our Pastor Michael, is with us today as our Wednesday guest, and we're going to be continuing in our look at the letter to the Corinthian church, 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 5 through 11. And Michael, I'm going to ask you to read this passage.
Right. Hear the word of the Lord. After all, who is Apollos? Who is Paul? We are only God's servants through whom you believe the good news. Each of us did the work the Lord gave us. I planted the seed in your hearts, and Apollos watered it, but it was God who made it grow. It's not important who does the planting or who does the watering. What's important is that God makes the seed grow. The one who plants and the one who waters work together with the same purpose, and both will be rewarded for their own hard work. For we are both God's workers, and you are God's field. You are God's building. Because of God's grace to me, I have laid the foundation like an expert builder. Now others are building on it. But whoever is building on this foundation must be very careful. For no one can lay any foundation other than the one we already have, Jesus Christ. This is the word of the Lord.
Well, thanks be to God. Well, there's two very common metaphors that Paul uses here and uses elsewhere. Jesus used definitely the one of agriculture. People during this day would have been very familiar with the process of building and working in the fields and doing farming. Everyone had to do that. One of the things I really like about the image of farming is that it's a powerful reminder that you're not in control. Like there's so much work in farming. There's so much that you can do, but in the end, you cannot make the one thing that you want to do, which is grow the plant, is actually something you can't do. It's not within your power. You can kind of create the conditions, you can protect it from pests and do all that. But in the end, the one thing you want to have happen, make the plant grow, is not within your power. I'm told that there's a saying, an old saying amongst farmers, that the secret to farming is 1 part sunshine, 2 parts water, 3 parts prayer. Which is, kind of points to this same reality that you recognize that your very task, your very endeavor, your very goal is not within your reach. There's something larger that has to take place that you don't have control of. Michael, I've never gardened except as a kid. I understand that you gardened, and maybe you have some experience with this.
Yeah. So to say I have experience is definitely, I want to certainly say it's limited experience. But my wife and I, we planted a garden this past year, and we have a bunch of plants in our house that mostly she takes care of, but I get to enjoy the fruits of that care. But yeah, one thing I noticed about gardening is that yeah, you don't have much control over the growth, but you want to have a lot of control over the growth. But something that's really interesting is this idea of planting and watering. It made me think about how I'm the type that, like, Grace, my wife, she'll water the plant, and I'll feel like it's not enough. And so I'll go in and I'll go water the plant, making sure it has enough. But what this ends up doing, for anyone who knows who waters plants, is that you can overwater plants. Like, who knew? And they start to drown, and they start to experience some side effects. Like, some of the leaves will brown if you do way too much. Like, root rot will occur, and then eventually the plant will die. And after killing enough of my wife's plants, I'm no longer allowed to water the plant. But when it comes to gardening, sometimes you think, like, okay, if I just like plant as many seeds as I can, like, that is going to give the best, the most, end up in the most likely having the best fruit, or the best garden. And sometimes that's the case, but actually, like, what in research and in our experience, we find that it's actually better to just be more intentional about where you're planting and how you're planting versus like the amount you're planting, because overplanting can also be really harmful. It can lead to plants competing for nutrients. It can lead to plants entangling with one another. It can lead to again, death. And that's just like not what you want. And so, like, I really find this metaphor to be helpful when Paul talks about, like, how I think sometimes we just like want to do too much, and so we end up overwatering, or we overplant, and we want, and versus like just plant, like just do what God is asking you to do, and He's going to take care of the rest. And it really made me think about this question that I feel like I often ask, like, God, what do you want me to do? But I actually don't ever ask probably a just as important question of, like, God, what do you not want me to do? And it's actually a lot easier at times, like to do what God wants me to do, and it's a lot harder to not do the things that God hasn't asked me to do. And that's kind of, as I was reading this passage, I was like, whoa, I have never thought about that. But that's a question that I'm now asking myself and asking God, like, what is it that you, not only what is it that you want me to do, but God, what is it that you don't want me to do? And am I willing to not do that, so that it can grow?
I wonder if that impulse to want to do too much is maybe connected to um, a sense that the Corinthians have had here, in that they overestimate the importance of their contribution. They overestimate, like the beginning of this passage, like who is Apollos, who is Paul. Like even in dividing into these factions, they're kind of overestimating the contribution that each of these people is making, because the one unique contribution is that of the foundation, Jesus Christ. The rest of it is they're helpful, but they're not essential. Like God can make his plan, God can grow his garden without a Paul, without an Apollos. He can raise up another person if needed. In fact, Paul wasn't even around for much of the ministry, or for all of the ministry of Jesus. He doesn't come until later. So God can raise up people in ways that we can't imagine. So our contribution's not nearly as, it's welcome, but it's not always nearly as important as we might like to think.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
No, I think it just made this thought come to mind about how this garden language really points to God as the creator, like God is the giver of life, and it kind of points back to Genesis, where I think it's easy to make, and it is about us in a way, like but God plants the garden, right? He creates the garden, and when he creates us, we are there to like steward the garden. We actually don't create anything in that garden. He gives us a task to do. And we do the very thing he does not want us to do, which is to like eat from the fruit. And I'm like, it just makes me more and more think about that, like how we had all these things that God was like, oh, look at all these things that you can do that I want to bless you with, and yet we didn't refrain. And I know I experienced this in my own life, where I have a hard time not refraining from the things that I probably know I shouldn't do. And I think Paul speaks about this earlier in his letter, or it's in Romans, where he talks about that very idea, doing the very thing we do not want to do. Mm-hmm. And I think it does come down to that, like we want to be recognized, we want to be known, we want to have influence, we want to like have purpose and contribution to this world, which are all good things. But when our focus becomes that, I think it can lead to a lot of harm that we don't necessarily intend, but we still might create.
This thinking about what we should do and what we should not do, or even should recognize what's within our power, what's not. I really like how this is encapsulated in North Point Community Church's mission. The church I previously served at, and at High Rock, our missions are really similar. At my previous church, it was connecting to Christ, community, and calling. The wording we have at High Rock is, connecting to God personally, to God's people, and to God's purposes. That's the same thing as Christ, community, and calling. And a lot of different churches, as I've looked at mission statements, have very similar statements. North Point's is similar. It has those three things, but it's a little bit different in that they say that their mission is to create environments, spiritual environments, where these things can happen. And I really like that, because it recognizes that what's inherent in our mission is like, we can't actually do any of those things. I can't connect anybody to God. I can't connect anybody to God's people, and I can't connect anybody to God's purposes. At least that's not fully within my power. What I can do, and what we can do as a community, is we can help create these spiritual environments that are ideal for growth, or optimal for growth. We can kind of remove some of the barriers. We can kind of help create conditions where it's more likely to happen, or can more easily happen. And to me, that's a good way of thinking about it, with, kind of like with this gardening metaphor, that, in the garden, I can create an optimal environment for the plants to grow, but I can't make them grow. Mm-hmm. And so that, on the one hand, I think this idea really helps me focus in on what it is that is, my job is I can't make people grow. And if people grow or don't grow, that's in the end, that's not up to me. And so in a way that kind of alleviates the pressure on me and anxiety on me. Like, I can't take responsibility for what happens in people's hearts, that's between them and God. But what I can take responsibility for is, am I doing, what God has gifted me to do and called me to do and called us to do in creating these environments where people can have that opportunity to connect to God. Whether they take that opportunity or where that opportunity takes root, I can't control, but I can look at the concrete things about how we can create those environments. Like doing this devotional, we can do some preparation. We can think about some of these ideas. We can kind of connect it to our theological training. We can try to clear away some of the confusion and maybe misapplications people might have. I think of that as sort of like weeding, pulling the weeds out of the garden or moving the stones out of the garden so things can grow. But in the end, I can't make it happen. It's kind of like the old saying, like, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. A similar idea here. There's a limitation to what we can do. And not only does that help direct me, but as I said before, that alleviates some of the pressure that I feel and the responsibility that I feel that, I don't want to take responsibility for things that in the end I really can't do. And so I find some freedom in this passage, as well as like a correction. There's a freedom in it if we accept it.
Yeah. It's this reminder of like who the foundation is, like in Jesus. And I think like it also reminds me of the importance of prayer. And I love how we always, like, the devos don't end with just like, all right, see you later, like, take this in, but we always end by praying. And like, I've come to understand prayer is like this recognition that like God is working in the world, and there's so much that I can't do, and that I have to just trust. And prayers is like this act of trust, and to really ask God to do what God is going to do. And so it just, I just have thought about that in my own life of like, where prayer can kind of become secondhanded, but I think it's actually so essential because it's actually the majority. It's asking for the majority of the work to be done, even though it feels like we're not doing much. And maybe that's the point.
Yeah. And I think, as an application for people who are, joining with us today, to think about the relationships that are in your life, whether it's friendships, coworkers, maybe you're a parent and you have children, or maybe you're a small group leader or whatever. I think thinking about this idea of creating spiritual environments where good things can happen, and then taking advantage of those opportunities, if and when they do, can kind of change the way we feel about engaging people with evangelistic conversations or discipleship or whatever responsibility that you might have in those relationships. It's not something that you're making happen, but rather you create an environment so that those things can happen. You create, interactions where you have those opportunities for conversations and real heart to hearts. And anyway, we could go for a long time just down that road about how you create spiritual environments. But I think just having that notion in mind could be really helpful to people. I know it's been really transformational for me as a parent to think about, how do I create these spiritual environments so that those real heart-to-heart conversations about God can really happen and take root in my kids' lives. And so I think about that in the same way in ministry as well. Well, in any case, I think we need to end in prayer here. And Michael, actually, I'm going to ask you to pray. I was going to pray, but I'd really love for you to close us in prayer, if you will.
Okay, sure can. Lord, thank you for this time together. Thank you for this word that reminds us that you are the creator, that you are the one doing the work, so much of the work, God, but that you've also given us something to do. Lord, I pray that we could ask both those questions of what are you asking us to do and what are you asking us not to do? I pray that we would take this application of creating spiritual environments, focusing on what we can do, and then letting you work. And also recognizing that we're investing in something beyond ourselves. We're investing in something we may not see come to fruit, Lord, but that you have promised, your kingdom would be here, that your kingdom would come near. And so, Lord, I pray that we would plant seeds that lead to that purpose, towards that end, towards your end, to bring us all together, to have your love just be the center of all we do and all we experience. So, Lord, I pray that's the garden that we would contribute towards and the environments that we would create. It's your name I pray, Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Well, thanks, Michael, and thanks everyone for joining us. I hope that you'll be able to identify some way in which God has given you a garden to tend in your life. Go in peace.